Welcome to the Veteran Spouse Network podcast, brought to you in collaboration with Coming Home Well. I'm your host, Hannah O'Brien, both a veteran spouse and the program manager for the Veteran Spouse Network. On each episode of our show, I will host different guests to learn more about the stories, unmet needs, and resources available to our military and veteran families. We're the show that's making space for your stories, so that here you know you're never alone. Welcome back to the Veteran Spouse Network podcast. This month, I'm tackling a topic that we as a society don't talk enough about. In fact, many of us may not even know this thing that we're doing, and that's probably causing us a lot of stress, a lot of exhaustion, possibly even strain in our relationships, has a name. So, on this episode, we're talking about the mental load, which refers to the ongoing, often invisible, and exhausting cognitive effort required to manage, plan, anticipate, and coordinate tasks. So, it's not the act of doing the tasks themselves, but the constant thinking about what we need to do, what needs to happen, etc. And the reality is that we all face the mental load. And in relationships, both men and women experience mental load, but they experience it very differently. And unfortunately, the mental load is often very gendered and disproportionately affects women. But my goal with this episode is not to further play into these gender stereotypes and like hate on men, but rather to have a frank conversation about how both men and women in relationships are impacted by the mental load, as well as talk about how our military and veteran families are uniquely impacted by the mental load, and talk about some of the things, of course, that we can do to help us manage these impacts, both for ourselves individually and within our relationships. Today, we don't have a guest, so welcome to my TED Talk. And in case you're a first-time listener and you're wondering, why the heck should I hear what you have to say on this topic? Well, let me reintroduce myself. I'm Hannah. I'm the spouse of a Marine Corps veteran with PTSD and a mother to a 1- and 3-year-old. Can't believe it. I'm also a social worker and the program director for the Veteran Spouse Network. And I am an open book about my experiences related to any and all of those things. And so, in addressing this topic of mental load, I plan to share examples from my own life and marriage, as well as what I've heard from tons of other spouses, women, and parents on this topic. Because again, we're all feeling this. We all feel the impacts of the mental load, whether or not we're even aware that's what it is. So, it's time we talked about it. So, I've said this this term mental load a lot already. So let's really break this down. Again, we it's defined as this constant thinking about and planning for what needs to happen. This is all happening in our brains, and since we're often not fully aware of just how much of this we're doing, others certainly aren't aware that it's happening in our brains. It's also just rarely talked about, especially in relationships where it may be causing the most stress, which can then, lead to the big R, resentment. But really, the key aspect of the mental load is that it's often this invisible work we do that no one sees or is possibly aware of at all. And therefore, it's often not acknowledged. And no matter who you are or what stage of life you're in, you're experiencing the mental load on some level. It shows up in our lives, relationships, and at work. There's really no escape. So just to make sure we're on the same page about what we're talking about, I've kind of had some examples I wanted to run through of how the mental load shows up in various aspects of our lives. Again, kind of no matter who we might be. So this is happening at home, at work, and relationships. So what does this look like? At work, it could be kind of this invisible project management layer that's over your entire job, keeping track of a multitude of projects, remembering deadlines, constantly prioritizing and reprioritizing tasks, trying to anticipate or notice mistakes, preparing for any potential issue, really. It also can look in how we interact with our coworkers. So managing different personalities and, trying to anticipate how we should behave to one another or respond to somebody. And it really goes on and on. And so As an example, before I became our director, I started as a program coordinator at VSN 10 years ago. And even then, I still very much felt this mental load at work, but I also had a lot of very visible tasks. Today, that's really not the case. My role has really shifted, and the vast majority of my work is pretty invisible. Yet, I do hold an incredible amount of responsibility to ensure my staff and our peer leaders are supported and that we're serving our participants with high quality programming. So, my days, these days, really spend a lot of my therapy sessions talking about work and kind of how to manage how my role has changed. My team, oh my gosh, they truly are the best. But at the end of the day, I'm their leader. It's my job to anticipate their needs and support them really kind of before they need it. To anticipate and create solutions to possible issues, to keep track of all our projects and deadlines, and make sure nothing's falling through the cracks. And while I know my team values me and what I do for them, they don't and can't really see all that I actually do to support them. My therapist, I was talking about this one day to him, and he just used this term that like now I'm obsessed with. He said, as I was describing kind of how this felt, at least in the workplace, he said, oh, it sounds like they're borrowing your brain. And I really was like, yeah, yeah, a huge part of my job is letting my employees borrow my brain. And this happens at home too, a lot, and it's exhausting. So, just a quick example of this. We actually had a meeting on this today, but we're finalizing our Q2 priorities right now. And one of my employees, as we were, talking about his priorities, asked, hey, Hannah, it'd be really helpful for me to make sure I'm on track with my priorities if I could see your Q2 priorities so I could align with them. And I think I literally like laughed out loud. And I said, dude, I don't have them yet. Like, I can't make mine until you make yours because y'all are my priority. That's my job. I exist for them, for our leaders, for you all listening. And none of you will ever really know or understand what's happening in my brain to make that happen. And it's very different than when I first started out or even 3 years ago, really. So, some examples for work. At home, mental load may look like, meal planning, making grocery lists in your head, noticing when things are running low or anticipating really that things are going to be running low and that you need to get X from the store. Remembering birthdays, thinking about all the housework that needs to be done, and what you'll need to be able to do it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Home, there are the laundry lists, pun intended there. For parents, this is unique because a lot of the mental load for parents revolves around parenting, revolves around your children and their needs, keeping track of, appointments, homework, school events, friends' birthday parties, their clothes needs, food changing, their preferences. I'm certainly in my parent era right now, so we'll talk a lot more about this a little later in the episode. And then in kind of all of this, or a lot of aspects of this, there's also just a lot of emotional work going on. A lot of anticipating the emotional needs of others and then like what your reaction will be in those instances. So, real high level, we'll dig in. So, what's the deal with this? Like, why is this a problem? Why is it so exhausting? Well, it's never ending. The mental load is never ending. You cannot turn it off. Think about those people. I'm one of these people that like you look at their computer and you get stressed out instantly because they have like 16 different windows and each window has like 20 different tabs. That's like what's happening. That's our brain, and that's the mental load at work, or all those open tabs that are running in the background and that you can't close no matter how much you may want to. The other part that makes this really challenging is that it's invisible, so it mostly goes unacknowledged. And it's human nature to want to be seen, to want to be acknowledged for our efforts. And this is a ton of effort, but because it's invisible, they're because it's invisible, it's invisible. We're not getting that understanding and acknowledgement from others for what we're doing. And it's also just emotionally taxing. It's sort of by definition anxiety at play. We're worrying about things, anticipating future outcomes and consequences, trying to plan for them, experiencing decision fatigue, like all of this is happening. So it's mental and cognitive draining, but also very emotionally draining. So what are some of the consequences of just like letting this exist and not trying to manage it and do anything about it? What does it do to us essentially, right? And so same thing, we can think of this on some different levels. Like what is it doing us to us individually, like in the workplace, relationships? What are some of the consequences if we let it go unchecked? So individually, this is going to show up as experiencing burnout. We may, see those like shorter to have an outburst or be more irritable and then be more resentful. We're literally experiencing a cognitive overload. This is not good for our brain. So it can lead to poor sleep, increased stress, emotional exhaustion. Um, we may just feel like we have less capacity, less to give. To things, to people, etc. In the workplace, it can also lead to resentment. Feeling like your boss or coworkers don't understand or value everything that you do. And it can also, like, unfortunately, even lead to potential, like, it can potentially lead to inequitable career development because people don't really understand all that you're doing, right? They may think this is your job, but not really understand how much actual work is going on behind the scenes with those scenes behind the scenes being in your brain. Also can lead to burnout in the workplace. If you're feeling unseen or undervalued, or you simply just have too much on your plate that people aren't aware of, you're going to burn out, right? We know that. And all of these things play together too. So part of the mental load is like we're at work, but we're thinking about home and we're thinking about life and relationships. And while we're home, we're thinking about work and so on and so on. And so it just kind of like stacks on each other, right? We're never feeling fully focused, wherever we may wish that we could be fully focused. And then relationships is a really big place where we're going to see some consequences if left unchecked. So the resentment can really begin to build here if we're feeling unseen or unacknowledged by our partner, or if we're feeling that, responsibilities don't feel like equally or fairly distributed. So we may see kind of conflicts arise about like who's doing what, or, I felt like I've just become the default person for something. Happens a lot in parenting. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. Um, and it also can lead to like this difficulty delegating without micromanagement. So like we've definitely heard like a spouse say like, isn't it just easier if you do it? Or okay, just tell me what you need me to do. And then when they do it and they get corrected or micromanaged, it kind of validates that, well, yeah, it just would have been easier if you just did it. And then that cycle kind of just keeps going on and on and on. So like you've also heard the scenario where one partner asks their partner for help and gets angry when they respond, "Tell me what you need me to do." But that is the mental load at work. Telling you what you need to do is putting the work back on me, right? That's just assigning me another mental task to tell you what to do. So, in the mind of the person who's experiencing the mental load and being told that by their partner, like it just like, why do you need me to figure it out? Why can't you figure it out without me? And then there's that irritability or that resentment, and it starts building. So I have a prime example with my husband this week that actually, like led to a bit of a disagreement and then a valuable conversation as I kind of, I was prepping for this episode, so I was kind of responded in the context of discussing the mental load and how this is showing up in relationships. So our son is almost 1 and he goes to daycare. In the morning, I wake up, I fill his bottles with water, then go about waking up the kids, getting them ready, etc. And then I come back and I mix the formula before we head to daycare. Whatever, earlier this week, we're having kind of a crazy morning, and I had already filled the bottles with water. And while I was, wrangling one child for something or other, I asked my husband to finish making the bottles. So he's in the kitchen and he picks up the bottle and he turns to me and he asks, "Are these 6 or 7 ounce bottles?" Now, I very much expect that some of the moms and likely some of the dads who are listening are maybe laughing or heavy sighing or rolling their eyes right now, while the rest of you are like probably wondering what the big deal is or not even knowing what I'm talking about. So he's holding the bottle. The bottle has the water in it. All he has to do is look at it to see how many ounces it is. But instead, he asks me. In that moment, he chose to borrow my brain instead of using his own. But of course, I answered him. But when I brought this up in the context of mental load later on, saying, hey, this was a prime example of the mental load many mothers face, his immediate response was, well, yeah, I mean, I understand I could check the bottle, but I knew it would be easier to ask you. Easier for who? Was my response. And despite the fact that, y'all, my husband is literally one of the most intentional, like intelligent people I've ever met. He is one of the most supportive partners and fathers, and we really evenly distribute our parenting responsibilities. He was still stumped by that question. What do you mean easier for who? So I had to say, easier for you, not for me. And we had to sit there and talk about it for a bit. It wasn't instinctual for him in that moment to understand that he was inconveniencing me to convenience himself. And yeah, I get it. And this is dramatic language for such a small example. But the point is that for many people, parent or not, this is happening hundreds of times a day on varying levels and takes that cognitive and emotional toll. So, shifting gears, you heard in the intro me kind of talk about, that this is, well, we're all experiencing the mental load. How we experience it is often very gendered, and that women tend to be disproportionately affected by it. So let's break that down a little bit. Because of social conditioning, patriarchy, and cultural norms we were brought up with, certain things are believed to be a woman's responsibility, while others are believed to be a man's. And this majorly shows up in how the mental load plays out for individuals and in relationships. So, how do we see women experiencing the mental load? Um, well, as much as we'd like to believe that feminism has changed things, women are still largely expected to be the primary caregiver of any children, to manage the home, to keep things running, to manage pretty much everybody's emotions, to maintain an active social life, take care of their spouse, etc., right? Think the 1950s housewife. And then when you add on women participating in the workforce, none of those other kind of, stereotypical expectations really go away. And conversely, if we as women then become a mother, our expectations at work don't change either, despite the fact that our expectations at home have changed like as about dramatically as they possibly can. So in short, like we're expected to do it all when doing it all is absolutely impossible. And then we're judged when we admit this or ask for help. And because we're raised to believe this, we fall into these patterns and behaviors just as easily as men expect us to. I cannot tell you how often I'll realize like I'm doing something after months or years or even decades of doing something, I'll realize that it's gendered and that I was socialized to believe this is what I was supposed to do, believe, think, etc. Not what I actually thought was fair or right or wanted to do. I've even begun to notice some of this showing up in my daughter, who literally just is 3 years old. Small example, one of our dogs recently had cataract surgery and has had like a pretty rigorous eye drop regimen for the last 6 months. And I kid you not, y'all, nearly every day it's our daughter who's reminding us that Scout needs drops. And at first I thought it was cute and honestly truly helpful. But then I kind of began to see it for what it was. She's 3 years old and she was already anticipating the needs of others and feeling the responsibility of addressing those needs. We're all victims of this socialization from day one, and you have to actually be aware of something to even begin to challenge it. And that's hard when it's been like ingrained in you as much as it has for all of us, men and women alike. Because, yes, now let's talk about men. Men are very much victims of this socialization. The example with my husband and the bottles is a prime example. Because just like I was told that it's my job to take care of the children and therefore know everything about feeding in the bottles and do everything about feeding in the bottles, he was taught to rely on me to do those things, or at the very least, to tell him how to do those things. And again, this man is my partner in life and parenting all the way. He's got my back. We are a team. But we both fall into these traps because they're what we were taught. And men have their own gendered version of the mental load. They're taught that they're expected to be the provider, to do a lot of the actual tasks. Think mowing the lawn, fixing the house, working on the cars, etc. They're expected to be the emotional fortress that his wife's storm can crash against. And I use this metaphor because it was something the actual couples therapist said to us years ago. And the moment they did, it was like, okay, dude, like, we're out. But again, that shows you these are real beliefs so many of us were taught. Men must remain emotionally calm because women can't. But for men, that's a lot of pressure, and it's not fair. Men are also taught to be the problem solver. If there's a problem, they need to fix it. They're expected to be protectors, responsible for the family's safety. And here's an example of this, how this plays out like gendered reversed. And I don't know why this just dawned on me recently, but in the last couple of months, I found myself kind of thinking, like, what would happen if I lost my husband? And aside, from the obvious devastation, there are certain areas I would feel completely helpless and unequipped in, and they're incredibly gendered areas. My husband does our taxes, he does all the maintenance on our vehicles, he fixes everything in our home. He's the one who prepares for emergencies. Of course, he's a veteran. Talk more about that. Most of these things I spend approximately 0 minutes out of any day thinking about. But that's not true for him. Those are the open browsers in his head. And that is just as real and just as much of a problem, a stressor, as anything that's happening in my brain. So men's mental load is often even less visible because it's more internalized, with more pressure on protecting and providing. Women's mental load is often more focused on kind of the daily cadence and emotional continuity, while men's mental load is more focused on kind of this macro level stability, like more logistical, more about protection. Men's can be more intense and around these kind of like high stake areas, while women's is more just continuous. And obviously, this is all built around heterosexual households, but queer partnerships, roommates, workplaces, and friend groups, they can all fall into these same and kind of patterns, and these relationships can be impacted because of it. I mentioned I was in my parent era, and with again a 301-year-old, and parenting, becoming a parent absolutely changes the game when it comes to the topic of mental load. And this is again where it falls disproportionately on the mother. And I do believe that some of that is like biological, like evolutionary, like I can't say that word, but evolutionary. If we birthed that child, we know them in ways our partner never can, and that's not their fault. Our children's DNA lives inside us for life. You kidding me? And our body, and most importantly for this discussion, our brain changed to ensure their survival and is continuing to change to ensure their survival. So when you see this play out where the other parent steps in to help and the mother kind of shouts like, you're doing it wrong, or that's not how they like it, or, whatever they may say, something truly biological is at play there. And then there's the kind of logistical, patriarchal portion of it. When you think about like maternity leave is absolute shit in this country, so we know paternity leave is even worse. So by design, many mothers are at home with their babies while the other parent is not, or for not as long. And then if you have older children during those beginning months, you know, that other parent is going to be the primary caregiver for those children while mom is healing and bonding with the baby. So of course a lot falls on mom, and of course they know a lot more about the baby. A lot of factors contribute to that, including both parents' beliefs and behaviors. So this shows up a lot in my conversations with my friends, my fellow young mother friends, and we're all feeling this as moms. We often are or become the default parent, even though we have incredibly engaged and supportive partners. And I can't speak for them, but I know that I perpetuate that just as much, if not more, than my husband does. But again, that's because it's ingrained in both men and women that that's the mother's role. So let's take it back again to the making the bottles in the morning example. When I wake up, I go to the bathroom, I brush my teeth, and I immediately make my son's bottle. My husband, he makes his coffee. Now, this doesn't make him selfish, it doesn't make him insensitive, it's just what happens. Have I noticed it? Yeah. Do I have feelings about it? No, no anger or resentment, but it is kind of like that, that's interesting moment. And this is that gendered mental load at work. When I wake up, my brain is already thinking about the kids and everything they need, and it doesn't shut off until I close my eyes at night. This is just where my brain naturally goes. So I end up doing a lot of the things for the kids because I'm already thinking about it and it feels natural to do it. But in doing this over and over, it becomes a habit, making it much harder to break. My husband is now farther away from those tasks and knows less about them than I do. When we had our son and I was recovering, my husband started taking my daughter to daycare. And it wasn't until I was physically unable to take her to daycare that I realized I had become the default daycare drop-off parent. It's too many D's. This hadn't been anything we discussed or agreed upon. I just did it. And my husband just let me. My husband's a paramedic, so he has off days during the week when I'm working. And it didn't matter if he was off when I was working, I still took my daughter to daycare. Even when I was a hot pregnant mess, or even if it meant that I was like rushing home to try and take the world's quickest shower before a 9 a.m. meeting. And it really blew me away that I never thought to ask him to take her. Like, I never, not once. I didn't. I just let myself become the default, no matter how it may have inconvenienced me. Today I'm very happy to report that once I realized this, we talked about it, and now on my husband's off days, he takes the kids to daycare so I don't have to. But it just, again, you just fell into it. We both fell into it because of that gender norm. One more kind of funny example. When our son was maybe 5 months old, which is when we moved him into his nursery and out of our room, one morning, I think he'd been up in his room for several weeks at that point. I was running around in the morning and I asked my husband, "Hey, could you go ahead and get him up and get him ready for daycare?" Of course he said yes, but then he like froze. He was like, "Wait, where are his clothes?" And like right when he asked that, we actually both kind of just like froze dead in the face and then burst out laughing. Like what a dumb question, right? But the truth was he had never changed our son in his room, so he didn't really know where to find his clothes or perhaps even what size clothes he was actually currently in. Babies grow so quickly. But, I'll be real, like in that moment, wait, where are his clothes? I'm like, I'm sorry, what? Do you know what a dresser is? Do you think you can't like open that up and maybe dig around and figure it out? Like, why do I need to help you with this? And yeah, I could have figured it out, but because it had become the habit that I got our son up and I got him dressed every morning, it was a somewhat foreign task to my husband in that moment, in that particular period of time. He also recently asked what size pull-up our daughter wears, and it took my like overstimulated mom brain everything to not shout like, I'm sorry, are your legs broken? Can you not go upstairs and check? But that's the other part. You hear people talk about, or you hear moms say all the time, like, oh my God, I'm so overstimulated. And this is why. This is why the mental load. We're at capacity. So in those moments, all we may hear from the spouse is, I'm too lazy to answer this question on my own. So you do it for me. And that's where that anger and that resentment can really build. I've had some, talking to other moms, I've had some mom friends, ask their husbands, like, what would you pack for our 1 year old if you were to go out for the day? Only to be met with these like blank stares. I asked my husband the same question recently, and he's a veteran, so like preparing for all potential scenarios is a specialty, right? Um, and he was pretty decent at it, but he missed things, and I know he would miss things that I just know to bring, right? A little heavier hitting. And I've had moms like legit tell me, it sucks to say, but I can't trust my spouse to take our kid to the doctor simply because they know the spouse doesn't know enough to be able to have like a meaningful visit, right? They don't know the medical history. I saw something that was like like I don't know, microaggressions or something like, ways to fight against the patriarchy, and it was a doctor. She said if there's a mom and a dad bringing their kid, she always asks the dad for the medical history. And when they turn to the mom and they're like, hey, medical history, then she'll say like, why don't you know? Right? And we're like kind of laughing, but like also that's sad. And then yeah, it creates that situation where it's like, okay, the mom or whatever parent that may be in the household, it's like, cool, now I'm responsible for all the doctor's appointments. But again, then it feeds into it of like, well, now I'm the one with the medical history in my brain. I have a paramedic for a husband, so he's incredibly attuned to our children's health needs more than most people are. Um, but we see it show up in so many other ways. There are millions more examples like this for parents. And, I'm talking about parents with young children because that's where I'm at in my life. But this shows up with parents, children at all ages. And when these things are left unaddressed in a relationship, a lot of tension can be felt. And, I'm gonna talk in a little bit about some things you can do if you're feeling that strain. But before I go there, kind of like the last nuance I want to address is what this can look like in our military and veteran families because it does look different. And of course, I'm the spouse, so I'm going to start with the kind of a spouse caregiver perspective. So in my house, my husband's a veteran living with PTSD. And I do a lot of mental monitoring, monitoring his mood, behavior, tone of voice, body language, how he's sleeping, kind of what stressors are present, even what stressors may be upcoming, what can I anticipate. I'm scanning for and planning for any potential triggers a lot of the time. And as I'm sitting here and I'm kind of saying this out loud, like I wonder how surprised my husband might be to hear that, like to not realize how much mental energy I actually spend doing this. Um, because it's not just for him to like create a better situation for him. It's for our kids. It's for me. You hear the term happy wife, happy life, but what about like regulated veteran, regulated family, right? And that fuels like we feel the weight of that, the responsibility that's on us to protect against. With this, there also comes a lot of emotional labor, like to keep things stable. If he is triggered, I'm thinking about everything I can or should do to de-escalate the situation. Are our kids present? And if so, like how am I, explaining this to them? And, or, "Oh, yeah, daddy just needs a second." Um, I'm also often the one like absorbing a lot of the emotional overflow, kind of setting my feelings aside to help manage his in those moments. And we've both done a lot of work. So this doesn't happen very often. And even when it does, it's like on much smaller scales than it has been in the past, more like kind of grumpy moods or being short with someone or getting maybe angrier than I may think the situation dictates. But I also know what those big episodes look like. So I'm already in my head 10 steps ahead, planning on how to make sure it doesn't escalate into something bigger. Like, what can I do to take stress off of him? What can I help to get him through this, to help regulate him? Even if this is just like stress over the garage being cluttered and not feeling like he has time to organize it, which example of the male the male mental load. Um, so there's that emotional weight. For many spouses and caregivers, there's also a lot of administrative mental load. Maybe navigating doctor's appointments, going to doctor appointments, scheduling them, managing medication, bookkeeping, paperwork. There can be a lot of that at play in a lot of these relationships. And then, for individuals whose loved ones kind of maybe at higher risk or even in crisis, the mental load gets even more intense and even like higher stakes. So now we're talking about, safety and safety planning. So knowing what signs and symptoms to watch out for, how do I assess the risk? Thinking about safe storage, like who am I going to turn to? What resources am I going to contact? If X, Y, Z and the other happen. And there we very much know that there are a lot of spouses and caregivers who spend a lot of time thinking about these things. And then, if our spouse has, maybe dealing with mental health challenges or physical disabilities, we as a spouse may just have to take on more like actual responsibilities, which means then more mental load comes with that. So we may have to be the default parent or, take on more like home tasks like yard work or managing the finances, or we may be the primary source breadwinner bringing working. And all of a sudden now a million more browser tabs just opened. Yeah, enter caregiver burnout, right? So, that's again some high level stuff that's unique from the spouse caregiver perspective in a military or veteran household. But what about for service members and veterans? Because I think this is where there's a lot of difference in military and veteran families. For instance, think about what they did in the military and how they were trained. They're literally trained to be thinking 20, which is probably underselling it, 20 to 50 to million steps ahead, and to be planning for every possible scenario because their life and the lives of their fellow service members depended on it. That is training in the mental load. And this doesn't go away when they separate from service. The scanning for threats and exits, evaluating the safety of all locations and that constant rehearsing of responses to any potential threat. I've heard my husband and so many other veterans describe this. That is mental load. And when my husband describes what's happening in his brain around this, my brain just about combusts. That's sounds like too much to be doing in the brain, coming from what now I've detailed goes on in my own brain, right? They're also trained to suppress fear and emotion, to be, stay calm, push through pain, maintain emotional control, avoid showing weakness. Post-service, this is translating to kind of, we see this translate to managing the emotional expectations of civilians a lot. So, like, I have to be a certain way. I can't be the way that I was in the service. Managing their own reactions, hiding anxiety, putting on that strong face. This is the mental load at work, and it's exhausting. Um, Another example, many transitioning, well, not even transitioning, but certainly at transition, from the service. A lot of veterans may be kind of wondering what their purpose is now, where they belong, how they fit in society. Again, that's the mental load at work. And that transition period is especially, we know that it's especially difficult time period, but it's also a difficult time point mentally because of how much is training changing. So the brain's working overtime trying to figure out how to fit in this new world, even how to fit into their family now that life looks so different. Then you add on like
VA and healthcare navigation. That's a freaking mental overload on its own. Um, there's all that kind of administrative stuff that can come with that, managing appointments, getting claims set up, appeals, paperwork, paperwork, stress, 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 stress. It's a lot. And then if they are also juggling any physical and mental health conditions, now that's just adding to it. Thinking about medication management, you're navigating any limitations they may be having, managing their own triggers. I talked about all the work that we do as spouses to monitor the situation and try and protect against triggers. They're doing that work too. All of that stuff takes awareness, but they're doing that work too, and it's equally as high stakes for them, if not more. And really, I think this list could go on and on and on. So this is really different from what's happening in non-military households and families. Our service members and veterans have been trained to believe that carrying this intense, high-stakes mental load is not only normal, but that it equates to survival. Gonna let that sink in for a minute. And many spouses and caregivers understand this to some degree. They know their loved one's brain is constantly running, and, and that's why we so often take on more so they don't have to. So I talked about mental load is real for all of us, but it's really unique and honestly, I'd say really exasperated in so many military and veteran families. So I've painted a very vast picture. So now let's get to the good stuff, which is like, what the heck can we do about this? Because this takes a toll on all of us. Um, whether we're a veteran, a spouse, a mom, a dad, simply just a human existing in this world, we're all battling the impact of the mental load. And there are a lot of ways, actually, tons of ways you can kind of take back some power over your mind, both individually and in relationships, at home and in the workplace. So we're going to talk through each of those things and hopefully walk away with some good tidbits. These are good reminders for me. I practice some of this stuff. I could certainly be doing more myself. So let's start with what we can do individually. Um, Individually, I want to say the easiest, but also maybe the hardest thing you could do is just notice and name it. Awareness is the first intervention, right? Being able to say, this is mental load, and I'm carrying a lot of mental load today, allows you to begin creating space for change. So notice it, name it. Do whatever you can to get things out of your brain. I think of this in the kind of the work setting. I remember when I went on maternity leave for the first time. And so I'm going to be gone for 3 months, 3 weeks, 3 months. And I have to make sure people know how to do my job for that time period. Wow. Serious wake up call to how much of my job existed fully in my head. And when something's only in your head, you can't expect others to read your mind. And this is how we perpetuate more being on our minds and on our plates. So get it out. Put things on a shared calendar, create lists, SOPs. You can create an SOP even at home. Get it out of your head. Make the invisible work visible, whether that's writing it down, speaking it out, sharing it with the people who matter to you. It helps them understand what you're actually managing. It helps you understand what you're actually managing. Set boundaries around what you won't hold. It's okay to say, I can't be the one keeping track of X anymore. Whether that's just you deciding that that's not something that's important, or delegating that to a partner, for instance, and having that conversation. Really important, build in recovery time. This is huge. Again, probably the most important and also we know the hardest. But also, it's the kind of the easiest to do once you know how to do it. So start by finding the little things that help you unwind and kind of reset and schedule time for those things. Again, small things, right? It could be, a 5-minute meditation app exercise, a short walk, sitting outside in the sun and drinking a coffee, like any small thing that brings you joy, find it, do it. And make sure to also schedule kind of in those bigger acts of self-care too. Can I take a half day once a month and go get a massage or go paddleboarding or, whatever. Find your thing and make time for it. Big and small. Big, small, medium, all of it. This one I love. Practice good enough standards. Perfection multiplies the mental load. I can tell you this one has been huge for my perfectionist husband. Um, a messy house particularly stresses him out. So when we had kids who are by definition a mess, who literally you can clean the house and 15 minutes later they have destroyed it. And then on top of that, your parents, so like your time just evaporates. He really had to force himself to adopt those good enough standards when it came to the state of the house. Otherwise, he was going to be constantly cleaning every minute, every free moment, or going to be in a constant state of stress. And that's worked really well for him. It was hard for him to do, but once he was able to adopt that, it's good enough. Um, Huge amounts of stress melted off his mind. So that's some good stuff you can do individually. Those are things we can do tomorrow, right? Um, what are some things, how does this look at work? What are some things we can do to manage it at work? I mean, honestly, it's a lot of the similar strategies, just in the context of whatever your job is. Make the workload visible. So, this really should be a leader's responsibility, but if they're not asking about your invisible workload, tell them about it, right? Make it visible. Building shared systems. So like don't be don't be the me from before my maternity leave where everything's in my head. Create those shared systems, get that stuff out of your head so it's not just on you and people don't even see it. Similarly, make sure no one person on your team is the only person responsible for something. Especially, I mean, sometimes we have to be, but especially for things that other people are capable of doing, like, think kind of more administrative things like setting meetings, taking notes, organizing team events, like share those responsibilities. Normalize asking for clarity. When things are vague, the mental load skyrockets. So be clear if you're, giving tasks to someone, ask for clarity if you're being given a task and it's unclear. Recognize emotional labor as real work. This has been really important for me. I mentioned as I became our director and our team began to grow, it truly boggled my mind how much time I was now spending on supporting my staff. And it's a part of the job that I absolutely love. But I do actively have to remind myself that this is the job, and that just because I didn't like literally check a task off my to-do list, it doesn't mean I wasn't productive. It doesn't mean I did less work than anyone else. But it does mean that a lot of aspects of my job are not visible to anybody, really even me. And I love this one, the most important one that's so hard for us to do as Americans. Create a culture where PTO is actual time off. I know I too often fall prey to this myself. I'm off, but I'm still checking and responding to email. Um, Last Friday, for instance, my kids were off for spring break and my husband was on shift, so I took the day off to take care of them. But even then, and I took it off, I really did. I was like, I'm gonna take the whole day off. Like, I'm gonna be off. And when I put them down for a nap, I was exhausted because taking care of two kids on your own is exhausting. But I also began having this very real guilt about not trying to get like an hour or two of work in while they were sleeping. Because I was like, well, I can't say I'm taking care of my kids, like they're asleep. And I was feeling guilty, even though I had taken the day off. Um, but that's the other thing. Parents are always working. Parenting is work. But we don't think about it in that way. We don't talk about it in that way. And there I was experiencing guilt. Well, it's a work day and I took off just because my kids were off. Like, what am I doing counting all of that? Like, that's just the reality being a parent and one. And I was working and now I'm freaking tired because I was working. Lots of similar strategies, right? And so now we're going to shift to talking about what you can do in relationships. And again, you're going to see these themes. They're similar strategies, they just look a little different in the at the level that you're implementing them and the context of where you're implementing them. Um, so similarly in relationships, the biggest thing you could do is make the invisible work visible. Something really important though with relationships is that when you do this, it's without blame. And honestly, I think this can be kind of tricky. Again, I'm going back to the bottle example, but when my husband and I were talking about the bottle scenario the other day, um, he told me that he initially took like my response as like me saying like I was offended by what he did, and as a result, he said his gut reaction was like, "Well, I'm never going to ask you about that, or I'm never going to ask you something like that again." And I could tell he was like clearly hurt by my response. And I, in turn, could have easily been hurt or angered by that. But, we stuck it out. We did the work to communicate communicate where we were each coming from and how we felt about this sort of thing. And then, what happened from that is now we're both more aware of how the other feels. You have to name it. You have to try and have the conversation. Our partners can't read our minds. We can't read theirs. We have to talk. If you're an avid podcast listener, you've heard me say that. People will like hear my story and be like, oh my God, like I'm where you were. Like, how can I do this? It's like my husband and I, not only did we do the work, we do the work. And that work for us and for any couple has to be rooted in communication, open and honest communication. Another strategy in relationships is to shift from helping to owning. So when we think back to hey, just tell me how I can help you statement, like that's a trigger to a lot of people. It's no help at all, it's just more work. So helping transition that to ownership, which means that includes the noticing, the planning, the executing, the follow-up, not just the thinking or not just the doing of the task you were told to do. So for example, a couple may decide, you own the morning routine, I own the bedtime routine. You own all the communications with the school, and I own all our meal planning. And you have to figure out what makes sense for you as a couple. In our family, my husband's a paramedic. He works 20 hours, 24-hour shifts. He has no consistent days of the week off. And he's a first responder, so like when he's at work, he's at work. It's not like I can be like, "Can you just get that done while you're at work?" And so our system had to be a little bit more flexible. There are always like 1 to 2 days a week where I'm on my own, responsible for the kids or for dogs, and I'm working. Those are work days for me. And then 3 weekend days a month, I'm also on my own. So those days, I have to be responsible for everything. And I don't get days off because, as I mentioned, I'm a parent. And as a parent, you're never off when you're with your kids. And the only time I'm not with my kids is when they're at daycare. And when they're at daycare, I'm at work. So I'm never off. That's not true for my husband. He has off days where the kids are at daycare. So he has off time and I don't. And because that's our reality, when my husband's home, he does more. He feeds the dogs, he makes dinner, he washes the dishes, he bathes the kids. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not sitting on the couch eating bonbons. We have two young children, so again, you're always on. But he does more when he's home, so I can do less. And honestly, that's something we just fell into. We didn't really have like a conversation about it. But because we didn't have a conversation about it, at some point I really began to wonder if he was actually okay with it, or if maybe like was he secretly resenting me? Like, oh God, she just makes me do everything when I'm home. And I began to think like, oh dude, like he has such a stressful job. Like one I know I couldn't handle. And is that really fair that after like a long, potentially very stressful 24-hour shift, saving lives, I'm expecting him to do more than I do. And I really began to grow concerned that I was kind of creating an opportunity for resentment to grow. So what did I do? I shared it, we talked it out, and it turns out we really were on the exact same page and we felt the exact same way about it. But having the conversation still did wonders for our relationship. For him to hear how much I cared about whether or not it was fair, and for me to hear him say, I can't imagine how you handle everything on your own all the time, that allowed for deeper understanding, respect, and connection. So, again, talk about it. Another thing to do, this is important in veteran households, I feel like, is agree on shared standards. This is huge in our household. My standards and my husband's standards are not the same on a lot of things. For example, I mentioned he doesn't like a messy house. So what's clean enough for me is not what's clean enough for him. So not just agreeing, so agreeing on shared standards is really important, but also I think on shared priorities. So again, what's important, most important to me may not be what's most important to him. So we need to hear that from one another and kind of come to that consensus. Otherwise, again, it's just going to be like, why does he think that's the thing that needs to be done right now, and vice versa, and so on and so on. Scheduling regular check-ins. This is one like I personally feel like we could be a lot better in. I was spinning around in my head for like a month about, what I had said. I'm like, oh, does he really think this is fair? Is it building resentment? And it kept being like, oh, I just need to talk to him about it. I just need to talk about it. But if you have those regular check-in meetings in place, then it's just, oh, this is what we're talking about now. And you have to protect it. You have to protect it. I've heard people do this as couples. I've heard people do it as families when they have like older children in the home. To talk about, what's coming up, discuss those expectations, what's working, what's not. And of course, yeah, you guessed it, talk about the mental load each of you are carrying and make this a routine. Again, we've heard this, but in a relationship, it might look a little different. Use tools that offload the brain. My husband, for instance, he got me a skylight calendar for Mother's Day. And we're getting into it, and there's a lot more potential too as our kids age. But that's a tool, right? We can put things there and know that those things are there and check there first. Um, oh, my friend, I told you my husband has a crazy schedule. Like it repeats every 3 weeks, but the 3 week, there's no pattern that my brain understands. And I kid you not, guys, it'd have been like, I don't know, let's just say well over a year of him, working well over a year, probably years, before I put his shift schedule in a shared calendar. And I can't tell you how much stress and frustration and surprises and disappointments that reduced by having that, by just knowing I could check. For instance, I have a kind of impromptu work trip I have to do, and so like navigating childcare, like I just knew I didn't have to ask him. I just knew what days he was working and to figure out what needed to be done based on that. And I'm sure it saves him a lot of frustration when I would literally constantly be asking him, "What days do you work? Are you working tomorrow?" Like, right? It's a small thing, but a huge impact. And then when you're feeling that overwhelm, say it out loud. Like I'm feeling at capacity today. I'm feeling mentally drained today. It's so simple, but so many of us keep these things bottled up or to ourselves. I remember vividly when I started choosing to tell my husband as soon as I was feeling a certain way, it just gave me this instant relief. And then, to hear his response be like, babe, I'm so sorry. What can I do for you? Like, what can I do to help make things easier? Like, man, fell in love all over again. And life got a lot easier. And we recently talked about this too. I told him I worried that when, I said something like that, oh man, I really feel like completely drained today. I didn't want him to then keep stuff to himself. Like, what if he was also feeling completely drained, but was like, oh, well, she said it, so I can't say it. Um, and so that was helpful for us to hear. Like, even if we're both low, like, I want us to tell each other that. We need to know that so that we can like support one another and be a team and make a plan. And finally, acknowledge each other's cognitive and emotional labor. Call it out, share appreciation, celebrate it. A simple thank you for remembering we needed more diapers goes a long way in a relationship. Such a small thing, such a huge impact, especially when it happens over and over and over again. Because again, those things are bouncing around in our head all the time. So if consistently we can get that appreciation shown from our partner for seeing those things and valuing those things, that goes on, that's huge. And honestly, I've been talking for a while, and so I feel like that's as good a place as any to wrap this up. I really hope you learned something. I hope you walked away with some tools you can implement today, tomorrow, to start giving your brain a break. Talking through this stuff is so helpful for me too. I'm kind of picking the ones like, yeah, that could use some improvement in my life and my marriage and my household. Um, but the main goal is, with this episode is helping you know that the mental load is real, that it's taxing, and that the first step is naming it. And the second step is sharing it with the people who matter most to you. Only then can we open the door to making real change. So name it, share it, change it. I hope this is the first of many conversations on this topic because we're all feeling it, man. We're all feeling it. And it needs to stop being invisible. We need to be acknowledging it, naming it, supporting one another through it. So, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next month. Thanks again for joining us on the Veteran Spouse Network podcast, brought to you in collaboration with Coming Home Well. We thank you for listening today and hope today's session left you feeling a little more connected or gave you some insight into the experiences of our military and veteran families. Don't forget to check us out at veteranspousenetwork.org to learn more about how our military and veteran families can receive the support they deserve.